All right, so we're going to keep going with this lesson. So we just finished looking at the graph of cosine of x and sine of x, and we filled in a couple of blocks in this little table. And so we're going to do some other graphs. So you're going to need your own paper. And this is going to be lesson 4.5, day 1. And this is going to be the graphs of sine and cosine functions. Okay. And then real quick, I'm going to just do a little sine graph, y equals sine of x. Okay. So this one period is going to go from 0 to 2 pi. All right, halfway between 0 and 2 pi is pi. Halfway between 0 and pi is pi over 2. And halfway between pi and 2 pi is 3 pi over 2. And this graph is going to have an amplitude of 1. So I would need to mark 1 and -1 on my y-axis. All right, and then the sine graph starts at 0. It's going to have a maximum at pi over 2, 1. If you guys remember from this graph we did, we had a maximum right here at pi over 2, 1. All right, then we're going to have an x-intercept at pi. We're going to have a minimum at 3 pi over 2, -1, and then another x-intercept at 2 pi. Right, so then that's going to be one period of y equals sine of x. All right, and then we'll also do just a little quick graph of y equals cosine of x. Okay, so we're also going to go from 0 to 2 pi. We have the same little halfway tick marks. And this particular graph has an amplitude of 1. Now, if you remember for the cosine curve, we don't start at 0 at the beginning of the period. We start up at a maximum at 1. All right, and then we get an x-intercept, and then a minimum, and then x-intercept, and then a maximum. Oh, sorry. Okay. So the first example we're going to do, we're not actually going to do graphs yet. We're just going to determine the period and the amplitude. All right, so for A, we have y equals 2 sine of 5x. All right, so I'm going to go back to the table, and anytime we're trying to find the period, we're going to take of sine and cosine. We're going to take 2 pi and divide it by the absolute value of the coefficient of x. So in this case, our coefficient of x is 5. So our period is going to be 2 pi over 5. Okay. The amplitude is found by the absolute value of the number that is in front of the sine or in front of the cosine. So in this case, that number is 2. So the absolute value of 2 is just 2. All right, so for B, we have y equals 3/4 cosine of x over 2. Right, now I'm going to rewrite that. That could also be written y equals 3/4 cosine of 1/2 x. So x over 2 is the same as 1/2 x. So when I go to find the period, it's going to be 2 pi divided by the coefficient of x. So it's 2 pi divided by 1/2. And so whenever you divide by half, that's the same as multiplying by the reciprocal or multiplying by 2. So this one would have a period of 4 pi. All right. And then our amplitude is the absolute value of the very first number in front of the cosine, or the first number after the equal sign. So this one has an amplitude of 3/4. All right, a couple more and then we'll do some graphs. Y equals -4 sine of x. Okay, period is 2 pi divided by the coefficient of x. So that coefficient of x is just 1. So the period is 2 pi. And then the amplitude is the absolute value of -4 or just 4. Okay, so I'm going to rewrite this one too. So it should be 1/2 sine of pi over 3x. So the period is going to be 2 pi divided by pi over 3, or 2 pi times the reciprocal of that, which is 3 over pi. All right, now the pi's are going to cancel out, and that's going to give a period of just 6. All right, and then the amplitude is going to be 1/2. All right, so we're going to do some graphs. So for example 2, we're going to sketch one period. All right, and then for the first one, A is y equals 1/3 cosine of x. No. 1/3 cosine of x over 2. All right, so you guys take a second and write down what the period and the amplitude are, please. Okay. Then we're going to do our graph. And so what we'll do is just a y-axis and a kind of long x-axis like we did at the beginning, like we did these two. All right, at the beginning, we're going to start at 0. We're going to end at 4 pi. And then we're going to find halfways. So halfway between 0 and 4 pi is 2 pi. Halfway between 0 and 2 pi is pi. And then halfway between 2 pi and 4 pi is 3 pi. So that's how we'll label our x-axis. And then our y-axis has to do with the amplitude. So whatever the amplitude is, we label it the positive and the negative version of the amplitude. All right. Now, when we do a cosine graph, you don't start at 0 on the y. You start up at the maximum at amplitude. And then we come down to an x-intercept, and then a minimum, and an x-intercept, and then a maximum. Okay. That is one period of that cosine curve. Now, it looks just like this one. It technically should be twice as wide. We didn't draw it, and shorter. So we didn't draw it super to scale, but that's okay. As long as you're labeling your x and your y axis appropriately, then you're good. let's look at another one for b. We have y equals negative sine of 2 pi x over 3. Okay, so you guys go ahead and write down what you think the period is and what you think the amplitude is. So don't forget, we could rewrite that as 2 pi over 3x. So when we're doing our period, it's 2 pi divided by that, or 2 pi times the reciprocal of that. All right, and so what happens is the 2 pi cancels out, and you get a period of 3. And then your amplitude is the absolute value of -1 or just 1. So we are going to go from 0 to 3. Right? And then we have to find halfway. So halfway between 0 and 3 is 1.5. Right? Then we need to find halfway between 0 and 1.5. And that might not be something you can do in your head, and that's fine. A lot of these are going to get kind of difficult to find the halfway points, and that's okay. So to find halfway between two numbers, you add them together and then divide by 2. So 1.5 divided by 2 is 0.75. All right, so that's this one. All right, and then halfway between 1.5 and 3, same thing. We add them together. We get 4.5 and divide that by 2, and that's going to be 2.25. All right, and then we want to label our amplitude 1, and then the opposite of that, -1. All right, now on this graph, we have to be careful. Now the sine curve, regular sine of x, starts at an x-intercept up to a max, down to x-intercept, down to a min. But this one is the negative sign. So it's going to be reflected over the x-axis. So we're still going to start at 0, but instead of going up to a max, we're going to go down to a min, and then 0, and then a max, and then back to 0. All right. So that's one period of that curve. Now don't forget, these go on and on and on forever. Just repeats that pattern over and over and over again. But today we're just going to focus on one period. All right, and then for our last one, we have y equals 4 cosine of 3x. Okay, so we are going to go from 0 to 2 pi over 3. Okay, so we want to find halfway between those. So halfway between 0 and 2 pi over 3 is 1 pi over 3. And if you can't do that in your head, just add them together and divide by 2. All right, halfway between 0 and pi over 3. So you get pi over 3 divided by 2 is the same as multiplied by 1/2. So it's going to be pi over 6. All right, and then here, these two, you would add them together. All right, and you get pi over 3 plus 2 pi over 3 is 3 pi over 3, or 1 pi over 2. Okay. So that is your x-axis. Your y-axis, we need to label the amplitude and the negative version of the amplitude. And then when I graph cosine, I start, we'll come up here. We start up at a maximum and then down to an x-intercept and then a minimum and then an x-intercept and then a maximum. Okay, so what I want you guys to do today on page 306, it may continue on another page, starting on page 306, do 6 through 18 even, and then 40 through 48 even. And on that 40 through 48, it may tell you to graph 2 periods, but just go ahead and just sketch or graph 1 period, like we did in our notes.